Russia's newest weapon may be the most powerful nuclear missile ever built. On May 12, 2026, Russia test-fired the RS-28 Sarmat, an intercontinental ballistic missile designed to be impossible to stop. Often referred to as the Satan II in Western media, it can deliver up to 16 independently targeted nuclear warheads to any point on Earth, not via the shortest route, but via the longest one if necessary. Its suborbital range exceeds 20,000 miles, roughly 85% of the Earth's circumference. That means it can approach the United States from the south, flying over Antarctica, bypassing the entire U.S. missile defense network, which is oriented to intercept threats coming over the North Pole. By the time anyone sees it coming, there's nothing to be done about it. The missile lifted off in the Plesetsk Cosmodrome in Russia's Arkhangelsk region at 11:15 a.m. and struck its target at the Kura test range on Kamchatka 30 minutes later. Putin watched the launch via video link from his office bunker, calling it, quote, a major event and unconditional success. He announced the Sarmat would enter active service with a division in Krasnoyarsk Krai before the end of the year, the first operational regiment armed with the new system. The timing of the announcement was likely no accident. It came just 3 days after Putin presided over the shortest, smallest Victory Day parade in nearly 2 decades. No tanks, no missiles, no heavy weapons, attributed to the risk posed by what the Kremlin described as the terrorist threat from Ukrainian drones. Moscow needed a show of strength to compensate, and the Sarmat launch provided just that. The test follows the February 2026 expiration of the last nuclear arms control treaty between Russia and the United States, New START. For the first time in more than 50 years, there are now no limits on either side's arsenal. Russia is free to deploy the Sarmat on top of its existing ICBMs, rather than as a straight replacement, and to pursue the rest of its modernization program, including the avant-garde hypersonic glide vehicle, capable of traveling at 27 times the speed of sound, which can itself be carried as a Sarmat warhead, the Poseidon nuclear underwater drone, and the nuclear-powered Burevestnik cruise missile, a broader nuclear buildup that now has nothing standing in its way. So where does a missile that can reach anywhere on Earth actually get used? The answer almost certainly is nowhere, and that's the point. The Sarmat exists not to be fired, but to be known about. Its value is in the calculation that it forces on anyone considering a first strike against Russia, that no missile defense system, however advanced, can guarantee the Sarmat doesn't get through. Ukraine is not its target. NATO is not its target. Its target is the decision-making process of any adversary who might otherwise feel emboldened by American missile defense investment. In that sense, the South Pole routing isn't just a technical capability, it's a message. The United States has spent decades and hundreds of billions of dollars building a missile defense network oriented to the north. The Sarmat is specifically engineered to make that investment irrelevant. What Russia would prefer the world focus on less is the Sarmat's track record before May 12th. A February 2023 launch was reported as a failure by the U.S. In September 2024, a test at Plesetsk apparently ended catastrophically. Satellite imagery showed a 230-foot crater where the launch silo had been. The missile had destroyed its own launch pad. Then, in November 2025, a video circulated on Russian social media showing a missile veering sharply off course moments after launch, cartwheeling and slamming into the ground. Indeed, the only other confirmed successful Sarmat test came in April 2022, over 4 years ago. Whether the launch truly represents the grand advance Putin claims it does, or whether it was simply a rare stroke of luck for a troubled weapon that still doesn't work properly most of the time, remains to be seen. For a missile whose entire value lies in being credible, it still has a long way to go. No country has ever built a nuclear-powered battleship. The United States Navy is about to try. The last American battleship was decommissioned in 1992. The last American nuclear-propelled surface warship was laid down in 1977. Both concepts have been considered obsolete for decades. Too expensive, too vulnerable, relics of a different era of naval warfare. The US Navy now wants to combine them into a single vessel that's never existed before, build 15 of them, and send them to sea by the 2030s. The Trump-class battleship, officially designated BBGX, now BBGN, following confirmation that the ships will be nuclear-powered, would displace more than 35,000 tons, making it by far the largest surface combatant afloat anywhere in the world outside of aircraft carriers. For context, the Arleigh Burke destroyers that currently form the backbone of the U.S. surface fleet displace around 9,000 tons. The Russian Kirov-class nuclear cruisers, the only nuclear-powered surface warships currently in service anywhere, displace 28,000 tons. The Trump-class would be bigger than those, too. Nuclear propulsion isn't just about range. Though a warship that never needs to stop for fuel has obvious strategic advantages. The more significant benefit is power generation. The directed energy weapons and hypersonic missile systems the Navy wants to put on these ships, railguns, high-output lasers, conventional prompt strike hypersonic missiles, alongside up to 200 vertical launch shells, demand levels of electrical power that conventional propulsion systems simply can't sustain. Nuclear reactors can. The Trump class is essentially being designed around the weapons of the future, with a propulsion system capable of powering them. The strategic logic behind the program is rooted in the Pacific. China's naval shipbuilding output now runs at 7 to 10 destroyers per year. America's runs at 1.6. That gap is widening. The conventional response to being outbuilt is to build more ships. The Trump administration's answer is to build fewer, vastly more powerful ones, capital ships so heavily armed that a single vessel can project force across an entire theater without requiring a large supporting fleet. A ship with 200 missile cells, hypersonic strike capability, and nuclear cruise missiles represent a fundamentally different kind of naval power than a destroyer, however advanced. Whether that logic holds up in practice is one of several large questions hanging over the program. The first ship is estimated to cost $17 billion, more than the Navy expects to spend on each of its next 3 Gerald Ford-class nuclear aircraft carriers. 15 ships would represent a total investment that strains credibility against the backdrop of America's current shipbuilding capacity. The industrial base that would need to build these vessels is the same one currently struggling to produce 1.6 destroyers a year, a rate that North Korea, of all countries, has recently surpassed. U.S. shipyards were already short of skilled labor in 2025, driving up wages to compete for workers between yards. Then there's the history. The Zumwalt-class stealth destroyer was cut from 32 ships to 3 due to cost overruns and performance issues. The Littoral Command Ship program was widely considered a failure. The Constellation-class frigate was canceled last year, partly because construction had begun before the design was finalized, a mistake the Navy is now explicitly promising not to repeat with the Trump class. The Secretary of the Navy, who championed the BBGX program, was fired in April. He reportedly told Trump that to meet the timeline the administration demanded, the ships might need to be built in European shipyards. Trump refused. Reports also suggested his superiors felt the expensive battleships were crowding out smaller, cheaper vessels they considered more urgent. The design is not finalized. No keel has been laid. No funding has been fully secured. The first contract award is targeted for 2028, a date that falls in the next presidential administration, which may have different priorities entirely. What the U.S. Navy is proposing is audacious by any measure. A warship without precedent, combining 2 concepts the world had largely written off, built to a scale that hasn't been attempted since World War II. Whether it ever leaves the drawing board is another question entirely. The U.S. Air Force has just resurrected a weapon program, which no currently deployed defense system in the world has an answer for. 3 years after the Air Force canceled the AGM-183A air-launched rapid response weapon, it's back, and now it's being developed into something its original designers never planned for. The new version is being built to hunt and destroy ships at sea at hypersonic speed from a bomber flying hundreds of miles away. Conventional cruise missiles are fast, but trackable. Radar sees them coming. Defenses have time to respond. Ballistic missiles are faster, but follow a predictable arc through space that modern interceptors are designed to defeat. A hypersonic boost glide weapon like the Arrow does neither. Launched from a bomber, a rocket booster accelerates it to optimal speed and altitude, then releases an unpowered glide vehicle that descends back into the atmosphere and flies toward its target at Mach 5 or above, roughly a mile per second, along a shallow, unpredictable flight path that can change direction erratically along the way. Russia has known this for years. Its Kinzhal air-launched hypersonic missile has been used in combat in Ukraine. China has been testing hypersonic weapons at a pace that alarmed U.S. officials as far back as 2021, when the then Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs noted that China had conducted hundreds of hypersonic tests to America's 9. The U.S. had been playing catch-up ever since, and the Arrow program is now a central part of that effort, despite originally being canceled in 2023 after a string of costly failures. The baseline Arrow, carried by the B-52, and now, for the first time, the B-1B bomber, is designed to destroy fixed, high-value targets in heavily defended airspace. Command and control nodes, hardened bunkers, and air defense systems that would destroy a conventional strike aircraft before it got close enough to fire. That capability alone makes it significant, but it's the Increment 2 variant, announced in the Air Force's fiscal year 2027 budget request, that changes the strategic picture in ways that matter most for the Pacific. Increment 2 adds a terminal seeker and a data link to the existing design, and that combination turns a land attack weapon into a ship killer. The seeker allows the glide vehicle to track and engage a moving target in its final phase of flight. The data link allows targeting updates to be sent to the weapon while it's already airborne, guiding it toward an area where the target is known to be before the seeker takes over. What this means in practice is that a B-52 or B-1B operating from Guam, well beyond the reach of Chinese air defenses, could launch an arrow toward a Chinese carrier strike group and have it close the distance in minutes, arriving at a speed no existing shipboard defense system is designed to intercept. Of course, there were anti-ship missiles before. The Harpoon has been in service since the 1970s, and the long-range anti-ship missile is a more recent addition. But a subsonic or even supersonic anti-ship missile gives a warship time to respond, time to jam, to decoy, to fire interceptors. A hypersonic glide vehicle arriving at Mach 5 or above does not. Whether the ship sees it coming is almost beside the point. Nothing currently in service can stop it in the seconds available. The engineering challenge of making this work is considerable. Hypersonic flight generates extreme heat and physical stress on every component of the vehicle. Adding a seeker that can function in those conditions, finding and locking onto a moving ship through the plasma sheath that forms around a hypersonic vehicle in flight, is a problem that has no straightforward solution. Communication through that same plasma sheath, for the data link to function, presents its own difficulties. Lockheed Martin is already working on a multi-mode seeker for a hypersonic anti-ship variant of the Army's precision strike missile, and some of that technology may feed into Increment 2. But the Air Force has been deliberately vague about the details. The Arrow doesn't stand alone. The Air Force is simultaneously pushing the hypersonic attack cruise missile, an air-breathing scramjet weapon, small enough to be carried by fighter jets, toward operational service, and has now requested funding for an entirely new air-launched ballistic missile to complement both. China's hypersonic arsenal continues to grow. The window in which the U.S. could have a qualitative advantage in this domain is real, but it isn't permanent. For the price of one Tomahawk cruise missile, the U.S. can now buy 5 of something that does a similar job, and it just ordered 3,000 of them. The deal the Pentagon signed with Anduril Industries for its Barracuda 500M on May 13, 2026, represents something more significant than a new procurement contract. It's a bet that the way the West builds and sustains its arsenal needs to fundamentally change. The man behind Anduril is Palmer Luckey, the engineer who built Oculus VR sold it to Mark Zuckerberg for $2 billion, and then turned his attention to defense. His core argument is simple. Western militaries are running out of weapons faster than they can replace them. Ukraine proved it. In a high-stakes conflict, particularly one in the Pacific against China, U.S. war games consistently show American and Allied forces burning through precision munitions in days, then spending years trying to replenish them. The Barracuda 500M is Anduril's answer to that problem. It's a subsonic cruise missile with a range of over 500 nautical miles and a 100-pound warhead, capable of striking land and maritime targets from ground-based containerized launchers, aircraft, or ships. Crucially, the missiles are designed to operate collaboratively, networked together by Anduril's AI autonomy software, with some acting as decoys, others striking, the group functioning as a coordinated team rather than a collection of individual weapons. At roughly $200,000 per unit, compared to over $1 million for a Tomahawk, the cost difference is stark. But the more significant innovation is in how it's built. 70% of its components are commercial, off-the-shelf parts. The remaining 30% are sourced from multiple competing suppliers to reduce supply chain risk. A single missile can be assembled in 30 hours using 10 common hand tools. As Anduril's chief strategy officer, Chris Brose, put it, quote, "These are systems that can be assembled with tools, literally that you probably have in your garage. Screwdrivers, pliers, things of that sort." The production infrastructure is already being built. A dedicated facility in Southern California is already producing Barracuda variants. A solid rocket motor factory in Mississippi, making Anduril only the third U.S. supplier of that critical component, is running at full rate. And ultimately, production will shift to Arsenal 1, Anduril's nearly billion-dollar hyperscale factory in Columbus, Ohio, designed to produce missiles the way automotive plants produce cars. The latest framework agreement commits to a minimum of 3,000 surface-launched Barracuda 500M systems delivered over 3 years, with the first batch arriving in 2027. The missile is also being considered for a role that underscores exactly why quantity matters. Ukraine has been striking Russian oil refineries, weapon depots, and military infrastructure with long-range drones. But drones carry small warheads and are easily exhausted. The Barracuda 500M, with its larger payload and 500 nautical mile range, has been identified as a potential Tomahawk alternative for strikes deep inside Russian territory. The appeal is obvious. Where Tomahawk deliveries to Ukraine have been limited by scarce stockpiles, a missile designed for mass production doesn't have that problem. Whether Anduril can deliver on the promise is still an open question. The company is young, the production targets are ambiguous, and the defense industry has a long history of cost and schedule overruns that have humbled far more established players. But the Pentagon's willingness to sign a framework agreement for 3,000 missiles at a production rate and price point that would have seemed implausible 5 years ago suggests that at least some people in Washington believe the model works.